The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for our State of Commonwealth webinar. This presentation will last for about 1 hour, and the last 10 minutes will be left for questions to ask the presenters. Today we have Vice President of Economics and Consulting at REMI, Peter Evangelakis. For the past 5 years, Peter has managed REMI's team of economists, contributed to economic modeling software development, served as principal investigator on numerous projects, and he leads REMI's consulting practice from our Washington, D.C. office. We also have special guests from Old Dominion University to conduct today's webinar. Peter, will you do the honor to introduce our guests today?
Absolutely. Thank you, Amanda, for that introduction. REMI is, and I am personally, honored to be hosting the Dragas Center for the second year in a row as they present their excellent annual State of the Commonwealth Report. We've also had the pleasure of supporting their work on economic analysis projects, ranging from the impact of hurricanes on the Hampton Roads region to the impact of opioids on the Commonwealth. And just to say, since 1980, we have provided at REMI dynamic regional economic impact analysis software and consulting services, allowing clients across the country, including a number in the Commonwealth like the Dragas Center, to study a wide variety of policy issues at the federal, state, and local levels. So with that, it's now my pleasure to introduce our two presenters for today. First, Professor Robert McNab currently serves as the director of the Dragas Center for Economic Analysis and Policy in the Strome College of Business at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. He's published over 50 articles and chapters and is an associate editor with the Journal of Economic Surveys and a board member of the Public Finance and Management and Organization Review. He serves as the editor of the State of the Region, Hampton Roads, State of the Commonwealth, and Dragas Center National and Virginia Economic Forecasts. He has also worked internationally in more than 40 countries on issues related to the allocation of public resources. Governor Ralph Northam appointed Dr. McNab to the Joint Advisory Board of Economists in June 2018. And he has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Richmond Times-Dispatch, Virginian Pilot, and Daily Press, as well as television and radio in the Hampton Roads area. Dr. McNab joined the faculty of the Department of Economics in the Strome College of Business of Old Dominion University in July of 2016, and previously was a member of the faculty of the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California from 2000 to 2016. Professor McNab received his Bachelor of Arts from California State University, Stanislaus in 1991, and his Ph.D. in economics from Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia. And our second presenter will be Dr. James B. Koch, who is a Board of Visitors Professor of Economics Emeritus and a President Emeritus at Old Dominion University. He has held positions at Illinois State University, California State University at Los Angeles, the University of Grenoble, France, Brown University, Rhode Island College, Ball State University, the University of Hawaii, the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia, and the University of Montana. He served as president of the University of Montana from 1986 to 1990, and of Old Dominion University from 1990 to 2001, and was named one of the 100 most effective college presidents in the United States. I'll now turn the floor over to Dr. McNab to begin.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome everyone to our discussion of the State of the Commonwealth this year. And so I would ask, if you are attending the presentation and you have your mic unmuted, you could mute that, because that echo might feed back into our presentation. Sort of one of the lessons we have learned, of course, as we have worked through the COVID-19 pandemic. So today, I will briefly discuss economic conditions in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and also touch upon how geopolitical uncertainty is continuing to roil energy markets, not only in the United States, but also globally. I will touch upon the potential impact of proposed casinos in Virginia before turning over the presentation to Dr. Cooke, who will then talk about the role of higher education in terms of economic mobility. Of course, at the end of the day, all our presentations are available on our website as highlighted below. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. And that stimulating conversation opens up new ideas and new thoughts on how not only the Virginia economy is evolving, but also the interaction amongst the segments of the national and global economy. Of course, it does not go without saying that the opinions and commentary we present here today are our own. They do not represent those of the Commonwealth of Virginia or our governor, Youngkin. They do not also represent the viewpoints of Old Dominion University, its president, the Board of Visitors, or the Strome College of Business. Of course, this presentation would not be possible without the general donors who provide financial support to the Dragas Center for Economic Analysis and Policy. But again, the opinions and commentary expressed here today are our own, and any omissions or mistakes, of course, are ours also. So with that at hand, let's talk about the pandemic and how the pandemic has played out in the Commonwealth and the economic shock and whether it is dissipating. So when we look at average daily infections in Virginia, you can see that we have mirrored that of the United States in terms of the trajectory of COVID-19, that we've had peaks and troughs in the summer of 2020, followed by a higher peak in the winter of 2021, followed again by a late summer, early fall peak, and then, of course, the most recent peak of the Omicron variant. And since then, we've seen a rapid decline in the number of reported infections. One of the good pieces of news for the Commonwealth is that over 90% of adults have at least one vaccination shot. And that if we look at the Commonwealth in terms of the impact of the virus, in terms of mortality and hospitalizations, Virginia has fared much better than its neighbors to the south. We continue to see disparities with regards to infections, hospitalizations, and mortality for those who are vaccinated and boosted, and those who remain unvaccinated. There is a strong correlation between political partisanship as measured by the vote share in the 2020 election at the county level, and vaccination rates in Virginia, and of course across the United States. We see that at the height of the Omicron variant infections in January, that infections, hospitalization, and mortality were 15 to 25 times higher than among the unvaccinated when compared to the fully vaccinated, and even greater when compared to those who had received the booster on top of that. These disparities persist across health regions in Virginia and represent now what one might argue in the face of COVID pandemic fatigue is sort of an acceptance of the reality of COVID. One might argue that people are now viewing COVID-19 as more a personal decision with regards to vaccination, and that insurers are likely to start raising rates among the unvaccinated to reflect the higher risk and higher expected cost for those who decide not to receive the vaccinations in the medium term. If we look at how the Commonwealth has fared, the shock, of course, in March and April of 2020 is quite evident, with a precipitous decline in employment from 4.36 million to roughly around 4 million in the space of 2 months. Since then, we've seen a recovery in individual employment as measured by the red bar. Here in the latest data through December 2021, we see that it rose to 4.1 million, and we expect another rise in January given the good news that we've seen in terms of non-farm payrolls and individual employment at the national level. One of the more striking things that we are observing during this period of economic recovery has been essentially the decline and relative stagnation of the civilian labor force. That if you compare where the civilian labor force is now relative to the pre-pandemic level, and you can see that Virginia has less people at work or looking for work than prior to the pandemic. Given the corresponding rise in individual employment, it should be no surprise that unemployment in Virginia and nationally has fallen, but this, of course, can present constraints on future growth. If we examine non-farm payrolls, if we look at the number of jobs in Virginia, you can see that the number of jobs peaked at approximately 4.1 million in February 2020. Since then, we've seen a precipitous decline with the number of jobs shrinking quite significantly by April 2020 to 3.6 million, and then a recovery as Virginia, quote unquote, reopened in the summer of 2020. There was relative stagnation in terms of job growth of the first half of 2021, but then you could see in the latter half of 2021, job growth picked up significantly in the Commonwealth. However, Virginia is trailing the United States in terms of job growth with regards to the recovery from the pandemic. If we then ask, well, where have the jobs been lost? We can look at this at the industry level. And much like the United States, it's no surprise that the primary driver of job loss in the Commonwealth has been the leisure and hospitality industry. If we look here in Hampton Roads, where Old Dominion University is in southeastern Virginia on the coast, it is an area characterized by national defense, the Port of Virginia, and tourism and hospitality. And the most significant job losses here and also in Washington, D.C., both of which are economies driven in part by tourism and hospitality, have been in the leisure and hospitality sector. Also, if you dive into the national data, you would see that the leisure and hospitality sector has experienced the greatest number of quits and has the greatest number of job openings. And what does that mean? It means we see a sector that has incurred job loss and hasn't been able to recover to the levels of non-farm payrolls seen prior to the pandemic and can't retain its current employees who are leaving, one might argue, for higher wages elsewhere. Not all is bad news. If we look at the bottom of the graph, you can see that transport, warehouse, and utilities actually had a higher number of jobs in December 2021 when compared to December 2019, and also professional and business services. And so what we would argue is that January and February data, when it becomes available, will show continued growth in non-farm payrolls, individual employment in Virginia. The question is whether we would see observing commensurate increases in terms of the civilian labor force, and that will be the larger question moving forward. If you think about what has been happening since the pandemic economic shock, one area of concern has been the number of job openings and how those have increased over time at the national level, and the number of quits also increased at the national level. And we see similar behavior with regards to Virginia. If you look at the JOLTS data available from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, one can see that the number of job openings at the state level, again, these are recently released estimates at the state level, are at a historic level, and job quits also continued to increase relative to the pre-pandemic level. And so we have an environment in Virginia where we have a significant number of job openings, more job openings than there are actually unemployed individuals in the state. And that will serve as a constraint with regards to a continued recovery in the future, regardless of what happens to energy prices. If we look at the metropolitan areas in Virginia, one observes a somewhat different picture than the state-wide picture. For example, if you look at the smaller metro areas of Kingsport, Bristol on the Tennessee border, or Roanoke, Christiansburg, Radford, you see relatively low rates of population change, or actually a contraction in terms of total population over the last decade. Here in Hampton Roads, the overall population increased only by 3.7%, well less than that of the United States. And Virginia's growth is 1% of the increase in the total population from 2010 to 2020 was driven, one might argue, by growth in the two largest metro areas, two of the three largest metro areas in terms of Northern Virginia, which is part of the Washington, Alexandria, Arlington metro area, and then, of course, Richmond by 95 corridor, one might argue. And Charlottesville was not farther behind. Winchester, which is a smaller metro area, is to the west of Northern Virginia. What we would see here is people moving out of the expensive area of Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C., and trading distance for a decrease in the cost of living. And so we've seen a significant influx of individuals migrating from the Northern Virginia area into the Winchester metro area. One of the concerns that it continues to be had in the Commonwealth is the fact that while international migration has been significant and positive over the last decade, Virginia has had negative domestic migration. People are moving out of the state to other states in the United States. And so international migration has more than offset this decrease in the domestic population, people moving from Virginia to other states. But of course, given COVID-19, the question is whether the declines in international migration we might observe in 2021 means that Virginia is on a lower growth profile than it was in the previous decade. If we look at the impact of the pandemic on the civilian labor force in the metro areas, you can see that the civilian labor force in December 2021 was around 4.7% smaller than it was prior to the start of the pandemic, but the story is varied. In Winchester, the civilian labor force is essentially recovered to the pre-pandemic levels. It's performing better than the United States. But if you look at Richmond or Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Newport News, the civilian labor force is 6 to 7% smaller than it was prior to the start of the pandemic. And then if you look at the change in individual employment, you can see that we have similar declines in individual employment. So what we're seeing here is at the metro level, there's a varied story. Two of the three largest metro areas in Virginia, Richmond and the Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Newport News area, have not outperformed that of the state average, and essentially dragging down the state average. And then if you look at the Washington, D.C. metro area, that the percentage change in individual employment there has shown that it is not recovered at the same pace of the United States. So Virginia's performance is essentially lagging that of the United States. But if we put these two things together, you have a relatively stagnant civilian labor force with increasing employment, especially in the latter half of 2021, which has driven down unemployment rates in Virginia. And if you look at this in terms of metro area employment, you see the highest level of unemployment amongst Virginia's metro areas is in the Washington, Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C., Maryland metro area, which is 4%, followed by Virginia Beach, Newport News at 3.8%, Richmond's at 3.6%, and some of the smaller areas are at 3% and below. So employers are facing a continued challenge in terms of filling open positions because the civilian labor force is essentially not recovered, which means that the ability of Virginia to recover jobs in the short term is going to be constrained because there isn't a significant pool of unemployed workers for employers to draw upon. And here you can see that while the recovery in jobs is accelerated and is approximately 2 to 2.5% lower than it was pre-pandemic for the United States and Virginia, the story is varied across the Commonwealth, where you see that there were approximately 5.7% less jobs in Richmond, approximately 4% less jobs in Virginia Beach, Norfolk, and Newport News, and approximately 3% less jobs in Northern Virginia, DC, and Maryland. And so if you think about the economy of Virginia being heavily concentrated in those three metro areas forming the urban crescent of Northern Virginia, Richmond, and Hampton Roads, accounting for approximately 75%, if not more, of economic activity in the state and over 70% of the population, you can see why those areas not recovering as fast as the United States have dragged down the performance of Virginia as a whole. So looking ahead, what are the prospects for 2022? Well, if there's one key word we've learned over the last 2+ years is that uncertainty and supply chain, and then you could throw in supply chains, and now we throw in inflation. In other words, we continue to be battered by uncertainty. Now, our projections are extremely clouded by the fact that there are events well outside our control. We know that we are seeing increasing levels of baby boomer retirements out of the civilian labor force, which is constraining the civilian labor force from the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is constraining the recovery to some extent. We're also seeing a great renegotiation as workers looking and finding themselves newly empowered or demanding increased levels of wages, salaries, and benefits. This, of course, is coupled with increases in the prices of durable goods, raw materials, and other commodities, excluding energy, has driven inflation. And the Federal Reserve, in my argument, is significantly behind the power curve in terms of tightening monetary policy, especially in the face of robust non-farm payrolls growth over the latter half of 2021 and into the early part of 2022. Of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it has roiled not only energy markets and commodity markets, it has increased perceptions of risk in international shipping. When one thinks of Russia and the Ukraine occupying 25% of wheat prices in global markets, one can see how this is going to create extended periods of inflation in terms of global commodities beyond just the energy sector. So the question is, how is this going to affect Virginia? Well, in two ways. The first way is that the change in the perceptions of national security are going to be quite significant. If you recall, we have been operating under assumption for the last decade that U.S. national security policy was tilting towards China and away from Europe, that Russia was a regional competitor, not a geopolitical threat. This meant that the U.S. Navy, Air Force, and Army were all planning for changes in how they would address the national security environment by moving assets towards the Pacific. The idea that was not far off, that Virginia and specifically Hampton Roads would lose potentially a carrier battle group or more to the Pacific because of the rising threat of China. Obviously, that geopolitical calculus has changed. What we're going to probably see in the short term is increased defense spending, and that means increased procurement of national security assets, ships, and airplanes, and increased training of those assets, both of which Hampton Roads plays a significant part of. And when you think about that, $25 to $30 billion of direct defense spending and federal spending occurs in the Hampton Roads regions on a given year, increases in the DoD budget over the coming fiscal year or two will trickle down, so to speak, into the Hampton Roads region and fuel economic growth. But on the other hand, the Department of Defense is facing continued pressure from increasing energy prices and other parts and commodity prices. The continuing resolutions have been estimated to wipe out between $20 and $30 billion of purchasing power from the Department of Defense because it can't reallocate resources in a timely manner. And if we think about how energy shocks have led recessions before, one might be significantly concerned that the energy price shock that we're seeing now, which has been amplified by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, could spark a recessionary downturn because of significant declining consumer confidence. So uncertainty and market volatility are definitely going to continue over the coming months. I'd love to be wrong on this point, but I fear not. Recessionary risk is definitely increasing. That will lead to declines in consumer and producer confidence. And sometimes recessions become self-fulfilling prophecies that if people believe growth is slowing and inflation is going to be higher, they act accordingly and create the conditions for that to occur. So the one part thing that we also looked at in terms of the Commonwealth was what was happening with the proposed casinos, because there's been a large push in Virginia to legalize gambling since the introduction of the Virginia lottery in the late 1980s. And so from simple scratch-off tickets, there are now a variety of ways to gamble in the state, including on your phone. You can, in the coming years, visit casinos in Bristol, Danville, Norfolk, and Portsmouth. And so one of the problems that we observed in the discussions of these proposed casinos was there was not much analysis in terms of economic impact. And most of the pronouncements were focused on job creation without consideration of the idea of displacement. If we actually look at estimates and recognizing that the industry says that the catchment basin for casinos is approximately 2 hours driving distance of the casino, unless you are a well-known international destination like Las Vegas or Macau, then you would have to say, okay, what percentage of people are actually coming into the region from out of state and bringing that money in versus essentially recycling money within the region. The so this auditor for the Commonwealth essentially looked at this issue and made an estimate that approximately 10% of net gaming revenue would be from out-of-state governor customers in Norfolk and Portsmouth, while in Bristol and Danville, that was 70% or higher. That, of course, affects our estimates of economic impact. If you have no displacement, then you get much higher estimates of economic impact. That is, you are just taking the money brought in by the casinos, and you're not accounting for the fact that some of that money may be displaced from other activities in the economy. That if somebody, instead of going to the movie theater, goes to the casino and spends money, that the economic impact is relatively small versus somebody traveling from outside the region and spending the money into the casino. Once we account for the potential displacement, here in the light green bars, you can see that the economic impact on annual terms for the Norfolk and Portsmouth casinos drops dramatically if you use the estimates on the previous slide. And this means that the net gains of employment that are often touted in terms of economic impact of those casinos really represent for Norfolk and Portsmouth a reallocation of employment from other entertainment and leisure activities towards the casinos. So while you might want to say if the casinos would add roughly 4,300 jobs in Norfolk, once you account for the displacement effects, that shrinks to just slightly over 400. And for Portsmouth, the 2,000 job estimate declines to roughly around 200. Bristol and Danville perform much better because the displacement is estimated to be significantly less, but they are also more vulnerable to competition from legalized gambling in other states. And if we think about this, casinos are destination entertainment. We've seen a significant increase in the ability of individuals to gamble, not only in convenience stores using games of skill in Virginia, but now you could take out your smartphone and place bets while a game is happening. So that idea that I need to go somewhere to gamble becomes much less tenable in the face of increased competition. We've also seen that most casino revenues after initial burst stabilize or if not decline outright, much like state lotteries have to continue to innovate and add games to attract customers because of gambling fatigue. One of the things that's also not considered is the social cost of gambling. There's the possibility of increased gambling addiction and crime, though the literature is not exactly sure on this, or it doesn't have a solid consensus on whether this will occur. At the end of the day, we believe that casinos will have a marginal impact on gross domestic product in the regions, but not transformative. This is not bringing in an advanced manufacturing facility. It is not creating thousands of brand new high-paying jobs. Most of these jobs would be classified as leisure and entertainment and a hospitality sector, and median wages would be likely below $40,000 a year for most employees in these casinos. At that point, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Cooke.
Okay. We're still working this out. Thank you. Yes, it's true that I was a college president for 15 years. That's not quite equivalent to serving a term at Sing Sing, but it does leave a mark. But it's something where I think actually that you have some of the same marks in terms of what you do. And I'm going to try to figure out how to move the slide. There we go. Thank you. Because most of you have attended college, probably earned a few degrees, maybe have kids, even grandchildren attending colleges and universities, you surely are familiar with U.S. News and World Report's annual rankings. They get lots of publicity and people pay lots of attention to those. The latest rankings put UCLA, the University of California at Los Angeles, as the #1 public university of the nation. They did lots to publicize that, and of course it's something that they probably should publicize. But lots of institutions that are not so well known make a big deal out of the fact that maybe they moved from number 97 to number 94. If they went the opposite direction, of course, they hide that and don't talk about it. But suffice it to say that the U.S. News and World Report rankings get lots of attention. But now let me refocus you a little bit and talk about some other ways that perhaps we ought to be ranking or thinking about higher education. What if we composed an index that looked at whether or not institutions are successful in moving their students upward, economically speaking, giving them some economic mobility? What if we looked at the percentage of minority students that they enroll, or the percentage of lower income students that they enroll? Well, these are things that U.S. News and World Report pays very little attention to. In fact, two of these factors they give 0 weights to, and they give a 5% weight to social or economic mobility. So what if we did develop a ranking that recognized an institution's ability to move students upward? Well, 5 or 6 people have done this, but most recently, Third Way, a think tank, came forward with a rather comprehensive measure of about 1,500 institutions, and they looked at 2 factors. One is that they looked at the number of years that it takes somebody after graduation to pay off the net cost of attending college. In other words, how much income do I earn and how quickly can I pay off the expenses that I incurred to go to college? Then Third Way weighted that by the percentage of Pell Grant students on each campus. Now, you can't receive a Pell Grant unless you come from a household that's really lower income. And even if you have a very large household, if your income is above $60,000, you're probably not going to receive a Pell Grant. Well, let's take Old Dominion University as an example. According to Third Way, it takes 2.61 years for an Old Dominion graduate to pay down the net cost of education. What is net cost? Well, that's the cost that they have to pay after taking into account scholarships and grants that they don't have to pay back. About 40% of Old Dominion students were Pell Grant recipients in the year they were looking at this. And so this ranked Old Dominion 128th out of the 1,500 nationally, but it was the best ranking in Virginia. Now, let me show you the ranking of institutions in Virginia according to Third Way. Number 1 and 2 are Old Dominion and George Mason in terms of moving students upward, weighted by how many students are giving that opportunity to. And let's go over to the right side, and you can see 17 through 20 are Virginia Tech, UVA, James Madison, and William and Mary. They all get smashingly good rankings from U.S. News and World Report, but in terms of moving students upward, they are at the bottom half of the Virginia distribution. They're not used to being ranked that way, but I'd like you to consider that maybe that is an important function we ought to be thinking about. Well, how much publicity and media coverage did Third Way's rankings get? Well, I'm suspecting that most of you have never heard of them, and so that will confirm the fact that it's close to zero. It got virtually no attention, even though one would think that this is something that the Commonwealth's institutions ought to be doing. Well, why should you care about this? Well, let's look forward a little bit to 2050. That's only 28 years away, when a majority of the labor force of the United States is going to be composed of individuals who currently are considered minorities. In other words, our labor force in that year is going to be majority minority. And the simple fact is that the institutions that are ranked highest in U.S. News and World Report aren't the people who are going to supply those individuals. Let's look at a little bit of that evidence. Here is the 50% minority labor force indication. You can see that that's changing rather rapidly, and it will continue to develop over a period of time. And we have to then say, well, where are the workers of the future going to come from? Well, now let me show you something from the Commonwealth of Virginia. This is looking at the percentage of Black and Hispanic students attending various institutions in Virginia. The black bar is Black, the orange bar is Hispanic, and the green bar is the sum of those two. And you can see that at Old Dominion University, 41% of the student body is composed of Black students and Hispanic students. You go to the right side, you can read those for yourself, but those are all terribly small percentages, which is all to say that these institutions to the right that are getting the highest rankings from U.S. News and World Report aren't the people who are going to be supplying your future workers if you're a manager in the future. They are not really tuned into the future because they are not admitting very many of the students who are going to be part of the labor force. Now, there's a frequent simile used to describe higher education, at least in the past, that it's a ladder to success or it's an engine of opportunity. And the problem is that particular simile did apply in the past, but doesn't apply so much now. Here are some examples of some people. If you look at the City College of the City University of New York, that's an impressive list of graduates, isn't it? Or that middle dot, you look at the University of California, Berkeley, 29 Nobel Prize winners, or it's a pretty impressive list of graduates of HBCUs. All of these individuals used higher education as that ladder of opportunity to move upward in society. And the problem is that is gradually disappearing. The best work on this particular subject has been done by the Opportunity Insights group at Harvard. And what they've shown is that income mobility has been declining. The probability that a child, a college student, is going to earn a higher income than his parents has gone down 18% over the last 40 years. There are a lot of confirming studies of this, including one not so long ago by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago that shows that economic mobility has been declining. Now, in order to give mobility, you have to be willing to admit students who come from lower income households. And once again, if you look at the left side of this graph, William and Mary is admitting only 1.3% of its student body from the lowest 20% of the income distribution. And you can see the other numbers. We can move to the right and we can see at Washington and Lee in Virginia, a very fine independent institution is 1.1%. At Hampton Sydney, it's 1.4%. So if you're thinking about moving upward, the problem is these institutions probably are not going to grant you admission. Their current student bodies tell that. Now, another way to look at this, again, is to look at Pell Grant recipients. And the Pell Grant recipients are people, again, who come from lower income households. And you can read those percentages yourself. But William & Mary's 10% is the lowest of any four-year institution in the United States. So that is not a mobility favorable institution. Well, why is all of this happening? Well, if there were a simple one reason, we could all focus on that, but there isn't. There's not a single cause, and since I've done a good deal of research and writing on this particular subject, I've picked out 10 factors, and we can't possibly go through all those today. I'm going to pay a little bit more attention to declining state financial support because most public university college presidents blame their increased prices and costs on that. But let's just focus on a couple of these others for a moment. Look at number 2. Brand name institutions have acquired substantial price-making power. If you're UCLA, for example, you get 110,000 applications a year. That means that you can select a student body, you can increase prices, and you're still going to get a very attractive student body because of how many applications you're getting. And so, of course, if you're the University of Virginia or the University of Michigan, to name 2 others, you have that price-making power, and that has enabled them to increase prices well above increased costs that they are experiencing. Let's spend a moment on administrative bloat. It's a common complaint out there that institutions have too many assistant deans and directors and the like, and there is a certain amount of truth to that. The data indicate that universities are spending more on administration as a rule now than they used to. I will shamelessly now tell you where you can find information about these particular factors. I published 2 books recently, the one on the left by the Brookings Institution, the one on the right recently by Johns Hopkins, and I go into some degree of detail. But I said I would focus a little bit on this notion of states not supplying enough financial sustenance, and there's a certain truth to that. This factor is maybe responsible for 40 to 50% of all the increased tuition and fees universities are charging, or at least the public universities, because you can see that back in 1980, roughly 21% of the freight was being paid for by students, and now it's up to 43 or 44%. So there's been a reversal of support, or at least a withdrawal of support by a lot of public enterprises, and that does account for some of what we've seen. This is a little bit more of a complicated graph, but it shows price changes and compares what's happened in higher education to the rest of the world. That dark red line on the top is public higher education costs. And you can see I've indexed that. It starts at an index of 1 in January of 2000 and goes up to 2.967 in 2021. That's a 196% increase. That orange line below, that's for private independent institutions. They've gone up a little bit less, but still substantially more than the consumer price index. That dotted green line, that's a little bit hard to see, that's the consumer price index. So you can see that higher education prices have been going up much more rapidly than other prices. Let me direct your attention to that brown line down below. That's what's happened to the prices of PC and computer peripherals. Why? Because they've had productivity increases and lots of competition, both of which have been largely absent in higher education. Let's look at Virginia again. These are percentage increases above the CPI, more than the CPI over about the last 20 years. Even Old Dominion, it's gone up 99%. That's a doubling. That's nothing to brag about, but it's the lowest in Virginia among the four-year institutions over that time. All of this has put students and households in a bind. They've now going into debt. And the problem is that Pell Grants, which are need-based grants, have gone down in real value. They're not as valuable as they used to. And anyway, that $1,466 is a drop in the bucket now in terms of how students pay for higher education. As a consequence, everybody's going into debt. And that 1.55, folks, is trillions of dollars. That's a stupendously large amount of money. Actually, the more recent data indicates it's up to about 1.7. Why should you care? Well, these people who go into debt, the studies say, are less likely to buy a home, less likely to start a business, and this will scare you, parents. They're more likely to want to live at home with you for an extended period of time. People regard student debt a little bit differently than other debt. You can see that blue line is credit card debt, but the orange line is student debt. People are going into more student debt than they are the rest of kinds of debt. All of this is one of the reasons, but only one of the reasons why higher education headcount enrollment has declined 10 years in a row. It's down about 2.8 million people over the last 10 years. Students are simply not able to afford to go, and that's one of the reasons why we see that. And so now I would say to you, to sort of sum this up, maybe U.S. News and World Report's rankings aren't telling us what we need to know. Maybe they're leading us down the wrong path. Maybe the ladder of success now is missing a few rungs, and that's one of the reasons why U.S. News and World Report isn't telling us what we need to do. And I'll editorialize just a little bit here and say, if we don't do something about what we're observing here, that the ladder of success is no longer there, we risk disruption and societal upheaval. And with that, I'm going to switch back to Bob McNab, who will tell you how to receive a little bit more information about the Dragas Center.
Thank you, Jim. As it says on the slide, and as I mentioned in the beginning, if you'd like to receive updates from us about our events and reports, please always feel free to visit our website. You can also send us an email. You can also text CEEP-ODU to 66866 to join our email list. And of course, we are active on social media. And we do put out up-to-date information and our media interviews on various topics, not only Virginia, but also with the national media. With that, I'll turn it back over to Peter.
Thank you guys so much. I'm going to take over from Peter over here. I'm just going to ask the questions that came in. That was a fantastic webinar. So the first question, I believe this one is directed at Bob. They were wondering if you could repeat and clarify the statement about health insurance policy rates rising on those declining vaccination.
Yes, I would argue that what we will see over the coming months and years is that health insurers, unless prohibited by law or regulation, will treat vaccination status much like smoking or alcoholism. That is, it will be a differential price. And so if the private market is going to adjust for expected cost, they will necessarily price this into not only health insurance, but likely life insurance calculations. Why? Because vaccines to this point have proven to be broadly effective at reducing the severity of COVID-19 and the likelihood of hospitalization and mortality. And private insurers view that they're going to adjust for risk.
Awesome. The next question that was asked was, why has Virginia's labor force participation recovered so much more slowly than the U.S.?
Well, I guess if we knew the answer to this, we could put together public policy to perhaps solve it. It's a combination of factors. One is, of course, that the opioid epidemic continues not only in Virginia but across the United States, and that has inhibited labor force participation, especially as you move towards the Southwest. In Virginia. We've also not had as a precipitous decline in some areas of the United States in terms of our labor force participation, which means our rebound hasn't been as quick also. Another thing that many may not be aware of is that Virginia's dependence on the federal government is higher than most states, and that is concentrated really in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads. Northern Virginia has become increasingly diversified in terms of its economic base over the last 2 decades. Hampton Roads has not. And so the lack of private sector diversification in Hampton Roads, which accounts for 1 in 5 jobs in the Commonwealth, means that it tends to grow slower and recover slower, especially over the last 15 years. And so when we put all those together, we find a relatively more tepid growth in Virginia over the last 2 years, even though the last 8 months have seen an acceleration of job growth and individual employment in the state.
Thank you, Bob. The next question is also for you as well. Why is Virginia continually losing population to other states? Do we have any hypothesis for this?
I think people vote with their feet about economic conditions. There's an argument in the public finance literature and economics that people sort themselves on taxes and government spending. One noted hypothesis is that people follow jobs, and there's been a higher rate of job growth, for example, in North Carolina and in Texas and Florida. And so individuals have moved in search of better paying jobs and mobility. That is one concern that needs to be addressed in terms of the diversification of the industrial base in Virginia. But also we have to think of Virginia as heterogeneous. That is, the characteristics of economic development in Southwest Virginia are much different than coastal Virginia or Northern Virginia. And so state policy needs to adjust and think about how do we foster economic development in different regions of the state. And that's a little bit harder for policymakers rather than one policy that fits everything.
Okay, thank you for that. Next question is, I'm just trying to reword this so it sounds a little bit better. When the market moves towards talking about the immune and non-immune, immune being defined as having had COVID or the vaccine instead of the vaccine or not vaccinated. Basically asking how is the market moving when people are vaccinated versus immune because they had COVID?
Well,
I think there would be a follow-up question from the first question.
I'm not a public health expert nor a medical doctor, so I'm not going to stray into that land. I think, how do private insurers determine whether you smoke cigarettes or drink alcohol? This is going to be sort of the same thing. And there's a developing medical literature on the persistency of essentially antibodies for those who have been infected with COVID and those who have been vaccinated, and that literature continues to develop. I think at the end of the day, it's a matter of private market pricing and risk, and that's if the state or federal government doesn't prohibit that price discrimination, and price discrimination from an economic sense, the ability of an insurer to segment the market into different groups in terms of pricing, then we'll see that that insurers and health providers will do that because they do it by age, they do it by other factors. And so one would argue that given vaccines have proven to be broadly effective in terms of lowering relative risk compared to the unvaccinated, that the private marketplace will adjust accordingly.
Thank you for that, Bob. What part of individuals not attending high education may move into the skilled trades?
I can attempt to tackle that and say that one of the real deficiencies of the American higher education system right now is that it is not very good at moving people into good jobs that are available that don't necessarily require higher education or don't necessarily require a college degree. Europeans, for example, are much better at that and much better at slotting people into non-college kinds of positions that are absolutely essential. We don't do that quite as well here. We don't have as many internships and things of that sort, such as they have there. So I think in terms of focusing public spending, even inside, let's say, states probably ought to place a little bit less emphasis on building new capacity at colleges and universities, building buildings, and spend a little bit more on programs that are job-oriented and ones that refocus people and put them into positions that are actually available.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question for you is, how do you get greater attention for public support for this new way of ranking colleges and universities? Is it personal reach, or should it be marketed this way?
Well, one can use a foghorn as I have, and you won't gather a lot of attention. Ultimately, these changes will come from governing boards, from boards of visitors, from boards of trustees. If you pay your president and the vice presidents on the basis of they get more money if they increase their or better their U.S. News and World Report ranking, or on the basis of how many research dollars they brought in and similar measures, that's what they will do. If, on the other hand, you reward them and give them incentives to develop access and affordability, that's what they will do. So I think that's the first place to start. A second place, of course, is for the Commonwealth's General Assembly to allocate funding on the basis of who does these kinds of things most effectively. That's not necessarily the way it is done now. And then a third thing is, I think this is a matter of public policy, we need more need-based financial aid. We need to focus on the individuals who, because of the increase in college costs, cannot currently afford to attend or have to drop out. So these are three, I think, action-oriented things, but a lot of the changes, frankly, begin at the level of governing boards. They simply need to stop emphasizing certain kinds of prestige-oriented things and say, gee, we ought to be maybe doing some different things in terms of how we incentivize our president and vice presidents.
Thank you. And the last question of the webinar is, are there any particular industry clusters where you see opportunity for good quality job growth, particularly industries that might attract younger professionals?
Sure. I'll take a swing at this and then toss it back to Jim for a conclusion. So if you look at Virginia, advanced manufacturing for one, renewable energy, cybersecurity, data analytics, health sciences are all fields in which we are seeing Virginia's metro areas, and especially those in the urban crescent, have a comparative advantage relative to other areas of the United States. And so if you look at the median wages, for example, in what would be a renewable energy or clean energy cluster, or cybersecurity, data analytics, or advanced manufacturing, the median annual wages are well above $65,000, $70,000 a year. That harkens back to what Jim just talked about, in that there are some people who want to go to college and have the skills to go to college, and there are some people who have the skills and ability and can go to trades. And there we've kind of seen a need to reevaluate how we allocate educational resources for that. If you talk to employers in those clusters that I've mentioned, there are definitely opportunities available. And I'll toss that back to Dr. Cooke to talk about how that plays out in terms of higher education and governing boards to incentivize that.
Well, actually, I'll attack this a little bit a different way and say that here in Hampton Roads, there's a huge new fiber optics corridor that is open from Europe to Virginia Beach. It provides, I think, all kinds of opportunities to link it to industries that need really good, high-speed, immediate internet access and related things. And I haven't seen much in terms of new developments in that regard, but I think the potential for that is just outstanding. It's something that other states would love to have.
All right, and that wraps up the presentation today. Do either of you have any last remarks you would like to say?
Well, I'd like to just say thank you to everybody for attending and for such interesting questions.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you.